So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, Earth.org Talks, an online conversation with Ashley Bang. Earth.org is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to the natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies, for the protection of natural environment, and an extension of governance or oversight to cover global commons. With Earth.org talks and interviews like these, we try to engage with inspiring change makers and thought leaders who share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience, all to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. This event is brought to you by the Hive Co-working Spaces, a place where passionate and entrepreneurial people can get together and can share ideas while growing their businesses. The Hive has a location in Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, Australia, Singapore, and Taiwan. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. She's a Fulbright Research Fellow. Ashley is a data scientist who has previously published research with her alma mater, Brown University, and with National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is NOAA, as everyone knows. This includes characterizing critical habitats of salmon in Alaska and quantifying coral reef resilience in Taiwan. She currently works with ADM Capital Foundation on projects like Eat Without Waste, which is an initiative addressing single-use packaging waste in like takeout and delivery sectors at the moment, as well as Oceans Asia, which is a project modeling the fisheries of East and South China Sea under kind of the various climate change scenarios. At the moment, we'd like to remind our audiences that there will be a Q&A section after this interview, so feel free to pop your questions in the Zoom chat box on Zoom here, or on the Hive country pages on Facebook. And we'll be sure to field those questions to Ashley right now. So thank you, Ashley, again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you on. Maybe to start with, we can kind of share about your beginnings as a data scientist and kind of like what drew you to data science and earth sciences in the first place.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to have this platform to talk more about climate change and the research I've been doing in data science. So in terms of my background, I grew up kind of all over East and Southeast Asia and spent time in the States for university. And just all along the way, I had a really great interest in math and sciences and also nature. I always loved, being outdoors. And so I think a really natural combination of all of those interests was earth sciences and environmental sciences. And what that really involves is just understanding how the planet works kind of on a large scale level. So like how our oceans and atmospheres cycle, what it affects all of these natural systems. And then on the more biology and environmental science side, thinking about how the living systems play into it. So both, things like mammals and insects, and also, humans were a big part of the natural system as well. And so at Brown, I studied these aspects in a very interdisciplinary program that covered both geology and biology. And this kind of led to my research themes that centered around quantifying how humans impact the natural environment, thinking about looking forward to how our impacts are affecting these systems for the next 10, 20, 30 years, and then thinking critically about what we need to do to mitigate our actions to make sure that these impacts are being alleviated, and making sure that we can have a very sustainable relationship with the resources and living systems on planet Earth. And so I think it's great that it all comes together, and I can talk a bit more about my research and my work on your platform.
Can you talk about what, a lot of people probably unfamiliar with climate modeling and kind of the data scientists in relation to climate change at the moment? Maybe can you kind of like share kind of the background concepts of it to the general audience right now?
Sure. So yeah, I think when we talk about modeling, it's really looking at things from a system perspective and thinking about the inputs, outputs, and what happens in between. And so when we talk about climate modeling, the climate has so many interacting factors that influence it. There's things like anthropogenic emissions, so the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we emit, which play into how we impact the climate. But there's also the underlying natural drivers, such as water cycling and ocean circulation, and even how the Earth's crust forms and works through things like volcanic activity. So there's a lot of different aspects to considering what influences the climate. And if we want to know what our world is going to look like 10, 20, 100 years from now, we have to go back to the basics and understand what drives the climate. And so that's kind of what all these hundreds of thousands of scientists around the world have devoted many years of research to doing, is really trying to boil down these complex systems into models that will help you really think about different scenarios of what happens if we increase the human population by a factor of 2, or what might happen to our agricultural systems if we had half as much water cycling through the atmosphere in the next year. And these are just random things I'm thinking off the top of my head, but with climate modeling and using these quantitative approaches to looking at our natural systems, you can really think about all the different possibilities of what could really happen. And I think this kind of goes back to when you asked, what got me interested in this field. It's just, I think the possibilities are endless to think about, how we're interacting with the Earth. And B, it's just, it all also comes back to numbers. And I'm a huge numbers geek. And so I think it's really great to be able to combine these two aspects and, spend time looking at the world through the lens of numbers.
So obviously with a lot of the news happening on the headlines right now, you have all these extreme weather events. Is there any difference between the climate modeling that we've looked at before, or kind of the weather projection? Is there kind of two very different data science that we're looking at?
Yeah, so I guess what you are asking is the difference between what we've been projecting in the past and what we're seeing now. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, climate modeling, is it different with weather projections? Because obviously weather happens very differently to
like weather forecasting.
Climate. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so actually you bring up a really good topic. A lot of people ask or kind of are a little bit confused on the difference between the terms weather and climate. And so when we talk about those two things, they're related. But when we talk about weather, it's kind of the local state of the atmosphere in one specific place at a certain time. So when you talk about weather, you could say it's raining right now, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be raining every day in that region. And so when we talk about climate, this is a concept that spans a broader time scale, and also is a more larger region or global level. So for example, climate can describe just the general, for example, if you look at a desert, the climate is generally very dry and characterized by hot temperatures, but you could still have rain in a desert, and that would be kind of the weather that you would experience day to day there. So these are two very interacting themes. And so things like your daily weather forecast rely on very specific indicators of, say, how atmospheric pressure is interacting with moisture levels, and that helps meteorologists and your daily weatherman come up with their predictions for that day or the next hour, what it could look like. Whereas when we're thinking about how to model climate over the time scale of 1 year, 10 years, and 100 years, that really has to condense a lot more big picture and broader interacting system components. So I don't know if that kind of helps segregate the two concepts.
Sure. And, the people always complain about, the weather forecast is very unreliable sometimes. Can we say that climate model is a bit more constructive in looking ahead? It's more reliable?
Yeah, I mean, I think weather forecasting is one of the most difficult things to do. And I actually took a class at Brown called Weather and Climate, where we had, a local weatherman come in and talk about how he would get all these angry messages on Twitter when he didn't predict the rain or snow amount correctly. But you have to think about the fact that all of these, every single cloud you see in the sky, right? It's just formed once and it's gone. And so just think about how someone could accurately, even with the best kind of technologies and radars and sensors out there, it's ultimately something that happens in a split second, and it's kind of impossible to predict with 100% certainty. But it is not to say that climate models and weather predictions are not accurate. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure, I guess if you've been tuned into environment or global climate change related news, you might have seen that recently the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their sixth report. And I think the previous one was published in 2013, so it's been quite a while. And so this is a very landmark report, especially now when the world is very much tuned into concepts of climate change that kind of, and where there wasn't an awareness maybe in 2013 as much. And so what actually is shown in this report is that, a lot of the underlying messages in science have been the same for a long time. And actually, one of the lead authors on the report was a professor in my department, and I was just reading an interview with him today that quoted him saying, in the broadest sense, the story hasn't really changed in this report compared to the last one and the previous one before that. The take-home message is that humans are warming the planet, and that warming is producing effects that we're feeling today. And those effects will only intensify in the coming decades and centuries. And essentially, the more carbon that we emit going forward, the more severe those effects will be. And so when you ask about kind of the accuracy of science behind it, we're inching closer and closer to having a lot more certainty and reducing the kind of plus or minus bar around these predictions. But overall, the trajectory of what these models have been showing for decades has actually been there for a long time. And so actually, I think it's interesting to bring in the concept of data science here, because whether you want to call it data science or data visualization or science communication, I think what's really kind of been changing the tide in the last couple of months and years that we've seen in terms of people's interest in climate change issues is how this same data and same messages that have been here for the last decades have been repackaged to kind of make people resonate with it more and connect with it more. And I think that's kind of where data science comes in, is you have the power to really make people, take what is traditionally kind of boring and, not everybody likes numbers like I do, but actually drive home a message that says, oh my gosh, something really big is happening and it has to do with me. And it's something that I want to be, involved with or care about. And so, yeah, that's why I think it all kind of comes together and why I'm so interested in it.
Absolutely. We talked about how, things have been aggressively or, exponentially increasing, with carbon emissions. Does that affect kind of past climate models? And how do you kind of adjust that or improve the current techniques and strategies going forward?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how familiar our audience is with just the concepts of climate change and what the models have been saying about warming, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of talk has been going around about 1 degree warming and 2 degree warming, and I think if you kind of miss that train, it's hard to understand what it actually means. Because for us, if you turn your aircon up from 25 to 26, it doesn't feel like a lot, but actually 1 degree of warming makes a massive difference on a global level. So if we just take it back for a second and talk about what actually is climate change. I don't know if you want me to just give a brief climate change 101 for anyone who might be feeling a little lost if they tuned in late or.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, because I just think back to sometimes I'm having conversations with my friends and they're like, oh my gosh, sorry, wait, can you go back a couple of chapters? So So essentially, I think the main message about what's been happening with climate change is that humans have been heating the planet at a exponential rate than what is considered normal, mostly by burning fossil fuels. And by fossil fuels, it means things like coal, oil, and gas. And so the heating that we're causing by burning fossil fuels accounts for about 85% of our CO2 emissions. And so, wait a second, what is CO2? So that stands for carbon dioxide, and it's a type of greenhouse gas, which are gases in the atmosphere that trap heat. And so greenhouse gases are typically a really great thing for Earth in general because it's what makes this planet habitable. It creates this nice atmospheric layer where we can all have a nice regulated temperature because of these gases that are, trapping heat in what is known as the greenhouse effect. And if you look at other planets in the solar system, Venus and Mars and Neptune, they all have really crazy daily fluctuations of temperatures that are totally unlivable for species like humans because they don't have the same type of greenhouse gas makeup that the Earth has. And so while it's a great thing for the Earth, typically we have been emitting as humans greenhouse gases at a highly accelerated rate due to our use of fossil fuels, which kind of brings us to this present situation where we have the Earth warming at a rate that is unsustainable for both us and other life on Earth. And so all of this, of course, has an overwhelming scientific consensus through, the IPCC reports that I mentioned and a lot of prior research. And basically, to stop this warming, we have to leave the fossil fuels in the ground where they were before. And we have to do that very quickly and transition away from this energy source very quickly, as in within the next 10 years. And so that's kind of an overview. And so to bring us back to what we talk about when we say 1 degree of warming or 2 degree of warming, what the most recent IPCC report was saying is that a 1.5 degree warming over the next 2 decades is virtually assured, given our historical amount of emissions. No matter what we do from today onwards, just given how much we've been emitting, especially since the Industrial Revolution, when we really kicked up our combustion of fossil fuels, we're going to see a 1.5 degree of warming, which is kind of scary. But thinking about the difference between, say, 1.5 degrees of warming and 3 degrees or 4 degrees of warming, as I was mentioning before, it makes a huge difference. If we look at sea level, for example, if over the next 2 millennia we stay under 2 degrees of warming, that translates to about 2 to 6 meters in sea level rise. And that already is pretty significant if you think about a lot of the low-lying islands and nations around the world. But if you go up to 4 degrees of warming, and we're talking about not just 2 to 6 meters, but double digits, which I think is catastrophic for many nations and countries and communities around the world. So I think what we talk about when we say 1 to 2 degrees warming, 3 to 4, it sounds a little bit insignificant. But when you think about the knock-on effects it has in terms of sea level rise and ocean temperature rise and ocean acidification and the melting of glaciers and then spread of wildfires and all of these other things that we've been seeing, it can get pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Well, the IPCC report kind of mentioned we're already 1.1 degree increase from the pre-industrial level. What does that mean currently right now? What have we already experienced based on this increase?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to answer it is to actually look around you. And I'm sure based on your platform, you could see a lot of the really scary news that's been going around. And all of these extreme weather events that we have observed absolutely cannot have reached this extent without human influence on the climate. And that has been confirmed through this report and other research. So it's really, I think it's the point of all of this recent media is and what's been going on in the world is just to say, hey, we need to pay attention because this is our responsibility, and it has been for a very long time. Talking about these, extreme weather events, which I think is one of the main ideas that you initially brought up when you invited me for this talk, is actually when we think about things like heavy rainfall events or flooding, for example, what's going on in China right now, and how that relates to climate change and global warming. Actually, if you go back to just the basics of how atmospheres circulate and how they work, is that a warmer atmosphere is able to hold on to more moisture. So that means before it reaches the critical mass or the point at which it starts to precipitate and start to rain, there's more and more water that can be stored before it reaches that point. And so as we have a warming Earth, the frequency and intensity of these heavy rainfall events will certainly increase, especially over land areas. So that's just kind of a look into how these systems interact, and gets back to your earlier question on climate modeling and all the complexities that feed into it.
Mm-hmm. But I've actually read a lot of articles out there right now about these current extreme events. A lot of scientists are still reluctant to directly link climate change to the kind of the causes of these events. Is that something that climate modeling, because it's hard to accurately measure the link directly?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, there's certainly uncertainties that come with any type of modeling, but I do think that there is enough evidence to show that, as I mentioned before, it's not like we would never have had any floods before. Floods are a regular part of the water cycle and atmospheric cycling. But at the same time, the frequency and intensity of these events is certainly linked to our human impact on the environment. And so I think there's definitely a consensus there, and maybe less of a certainty on to what extent. But that's, again, I think something that scientists continue to move towards and forward towards in terms of shrinking that error bar and increasing their confidence. But that, I think, is not a good enough reason to say, oh, we're not super sure, so we shouldn't do anything. Because I think even if you look around at even the pandemic right now, it was the origin of this virus was that it was transmitted from wildlife to humans. And this is a type of disease called a zoonotic disease, and that it's transmitted from wildlife to human. And as we continue to encroach on natural habitats, and as wildlife continues to be pushed out of its comfortable and habitable limits, the risk of having these diseases continue to proliferate, it grows higher and higher. And so even if we think about our impacts and the feedback loop in that way, the evidence is quite clear, and we don't really need to be able to say with 100% confidence what the exact, percentage probability is.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's kind of go back to your previous work. We mentioned in the introduction earlier that, you looked at salmon habitats in Alaska and even like coral resilience in Taiwan. Maybe you can kind of take us through kind of your projects and maybe understand how data scientists work and kind of in producing kind of policy recommendations based on your work. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned before, in terms of my interests, I really love I love using numbers to kind of quantify what's happening to our world, and specifically, I love being able to bridge those scientific findings with policy and action towards mitigating our impacts on the environment. So when I was working with NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, a lot of syllables, when I was working with NOAA in Alaska, I was looking at salmon habitats in river environments, because that's actually where salmon spawn. And then as they get older, they go out to the ocean. And then once they're ready to reproduce, they come back to the rivers. So the rivers and these kind of coastal environments are really important. And these salmon populations are really important in terms of an ecological sense, but also they support a lot of livelihoods and are really critical in terms of human food security as well. And so what we're trying to understand there was if you have a finite amount of resources to protect certain rivers or river habitats, where do you want to be allocating those resources? Because as much as we'd love to protect the entire world, there are things like coastal development and the growing human population that we need to account for. So in terms of coming up with a priority list, essentially, of where you want to be allocating those resources for protection, what we did was we actually tagged the baby salmon to literally take a look at where are they going the most, because where you're going to have the most salmon is where you ideally want to be preserving the habitats. And so that all came out in over months and months of monitoring their movement. And if you think about putting a little GPS tag on thousands of fish, you will have an immense amount of data after months of looking at their whereabouts. And so that's kind of where the data science aspect comes in. Is like, if I just published on, earth.org, look at all these numbers of fish, and this is where this one went on one day and on the other, no one is going to be able to make sense of it. And so that's where the data science element comes in, and you say, okay, how can I condense this large amount of data and extract the insights that are relevant and are able to address your ultimate goal of, in this case, where are the salmon traveling the most. And so using a combination of coding languages such as R, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, or using geographic information systems, which help you plot things kind of on a map. I was able to produce kind of heat maps that showed, okay, which areas are being frequented the most, and therefore be able to submit to policymakers a very clear and precise image of what they needed to take action on. And so I think data science is an amazing tool to, as I said, bridge the gap between scientific research and policymakers and other stakeholders, because it's almost like my mom always tells me when I'm like rambling on about my research. She's like, so your point is? And I think data science is a great way to do that, because with just one map or one piece of colorful visualization, anyone can kind of extract the key findings from it without having to, have a degree in science or an affinity for computer science.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And kind of linking back to your current work, you obviously, one of the big projects you're working on is about, quantifying the plastic packaging waste in Hong Kong and maybe Great Asia. How does that work, and what's kind of the most kind of surprising results you've found recently?
Yeah, so I think as a data scientist here, my role kind of becomes a little more diversified. And so I've been working on a huge diversity of projects, which has been really interesting for me, just to apply my data science skills and learn more about the Hong Kong and broader Asia policy landscape. And so with the project you mentioned, it's part of an initiative with ADM Capital Foundation called Eat Without Waste. And I think whether you're in Hong Kong or other cities around the world, you might have noticed that our habits in terms of takeaway and delivery consumption have really gone up during the pandemic. And Hong Kong was a huge culprit to begin with, even before the pandemic. And so actually, in order to address this problem, again, you oftentimes need to have an understanding of the baseline. So where are we starting from, and where do we want to get to? to start to address the problem. And actually, there wasn't a huge amount of research on the amount of waste we're creating in terms of these disposable food containers, beverage containers, et cetera. And so that's kind of where my data sleuthing skills came in, and where I started to extract Hong Kong consumption data and thinking about, patterns from other nations where there's been more extensive research. And what I have come up with my estimates is that we actually use about 3.9 billion food and drink containers in a year alone. And this was just for pre-pandemic data, and I was able to kind of verify a lot of it with local F&B stakeholders. But you might be thinking, what does 4 billion food and drink containers even look like? And that's not even thinking about the spoons and the cutlery, the napkins and paper bags and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're familiar with the IFC building, it's enough to fill the IFC building almost 50 times. And so we're creating that amount of waste in food and drink containers in 1 year. And that's pretty alarming. And so when you think about it in those terms, I think, again, this is where the power to visualize data that initially, is kind of all over the place and doesn't resonate much with people can really start to create a personal connection and hopefully galvanize action amongst the broader society.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, we're trying to make data more accessible to audiences. And as you mentioned, you came up how that amount of waste is equal to the IFC. Is it hard to come up with these kind of equivalents and come up with ideas that makes it easier for people to digest?
Right. Yeah. I think for me, it's always been a really interesting challenge. I really lately have been addicted to doing Sudoku puzzles. And so I think it's kind of similar in a way where you're trying to fit everything into a picture that fits nicely. And no, I really enjoy kind of the aspect of, data science being very rigorously quantitative, and that you need to make sure your data is accurate. The analyses that you're conducting are staying faithful to actually portraying the situation in the best and most accurate way possible. So a lot of statistical models have a lot of other analyses to ensure that it's not just totally going off the rails. There are a lot of checks and balances that involve a lot of numbers that I won't explain. But there's also this creative aspect to it in terms of, how can I think of something that resonates with everyone in Hong Kong, which is, the IFC building, where I thought about like the big Buddha. And so I think that's what really makes it fun. And probably you can speak to this more as well, considering that you're on the side that really integrates this type of research and is more outward facing in terms of getting the message across to a lot of readers around the world.
Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about the bigger picture of data science here, and how we can encourage using these kind of accessible data and kind of drive changes, particularly in people's individual behavior. How has it been changing for you in terms of delivering these kind of messages and numbers?
I think that, I don't know, is there a certain aspect that you want me to start with?
No, whatever comes up off the top of your head at the moment.
Yeah, well, so I guess the IPCC report has been on a lot of our minds lately. And if we think back to the core of data science and how it's been playing out in the climate change field, what immediately comes to mind is, I don't know if you saw Al Gore's documentary back in 2006 called An Inconvenient Truth. But that one is kind of a very landmark one, where he has this famous diagram that is, projected to the size of the auditorium, and it shows the exponential increase in CO2 concentrations. Okay, I'm not sure about necessarily exponential, but a very steady increase in CO2 emissions that we've observed. And I think that is one of the great examples where just a very simple graph can really drive a message home. And similarly, I think if all of you have a chance to take a look at the IPCC report, I think the actual report is over thousands of pages long, but they have a lot of different summaries for laymen, for policymakers, and they spend a lot of time. And I think there's about 14,000 studies that contributed to it, and many scientists that I idolize have contributed to it. So it is worth your time checking out, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So the more important question is, how do we use these data science to make policy changes, especially in governments and a more bigger international stage? How do we encourage and inform, especially in the time like when there's a lot of fake news happening, a lot of policymakers themselves don't believe in the science? What's the role that data science can play right now, especially in these times?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so as I was saying on that aspect of bridging science and society, what that also means in terms of policymaking is to actually put a policy in place. We need to have an understanding of the baseline and what the status quo is, and what are some possible scenarios going forward that the policies could potentially have an effect on. So if we go with path A, what are the risks? What are the pros and cons? Path B, what are the associated similar risks, etc. And so that is where it's important to take a lot of this rigorous scientific data and write it or convey it in a way that is going to be able to deliver the home run message in just a couple words or a couple figures. And not all policymakers have the time to go get a PhD in earth or environmental sciences or statistics. And so that's the important role that data science and science communication plays. And if I'm just to, I guess, give an example of the impact that the way that you translate data can have, is there's a famous statistic that fossil fuel companies are responsible for over 70% of total greenhouse gas pollution. And so when you hear that, you immediately want to go out to all the fossil fuel companies and say, what are you doing? Stop it. We have to take down these big corporations. But that's just one way to convey this data. Another way to convey the same exact data within a different statement is that actually consumers or households are responsible for a little over 70% of total greenhouse gas pollution. And that's because we're the ones who are consuming the fossil fuels that these fossil fuel companies are producing. So I think that's a really interesting example of how the way that you package data and the way that you decide to present it really changes the message and changes how involved someone is going to feel, whether you're going to feel personally responsible for these greenhouse gas emissions or whether you feel like you can kind of pass the blame on to someone else. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is a classic example. And actually my college statistics professor on the first day of class referred us to a book that was something about how to lie with statistics, because you think that numbers are the end all be all and it's very black and white. But as a matter of fact, there are so many ways that you can, as I said, package the same amount of data and come up with a totally different message. Mm-hmm. That it's important to be mindful, even as a reader or a consumer, of how data is being conveyed and how numbers may or may not be tricking you.
So how do you kind of educate people what to look out for? What are the red flags when you're looking at how data is packaged, how to avoid getting the wrong message from it then?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. And I would say that a lot of the number one suggestion I guess I would have is to take a look at the sources. Mm-hmm. And if there are no sources, that already is a red flag. Because, let's say you read the statistic that consumers or households are responsible for 70% of total greenhouse gas pollution, you might start thinking, well, what is a consumer and what is a household considered as in this statistic? And then you might go on to read the source, and it says, it includes commercial buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And so being able to, have that source of credibility, and then have the opportunity to dive into it deeper if you want, or if you so choose. I guess we don't have the time to do this for every single statistic we see, but for the things that you really care about and are things that might be the difference between you, for example, getting vaccinated or not, I think it's really worth checking out where the data is coming from, what types of institutions contributed to the research, and what they have to say about how they got to that number.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So this one final question for me, and then before we're opening up to the audience.
Sure.
So kind of linking back to your current project about plastic packaging waste in Hong Kong, what are the kind of big policy recommendations that you have based on your current numbers right now?
Yeah, that's actually a really timely question, because actually in Hong Kong, the government, the Environmental Protection Department, is actually in the midst of trying to ban disposable plastic tableware. And so that includes, styrofoam boxes. It includes your takeaway forks and knives and boxes. And so actually, can I ask, what is your immediate reaction to this news? Like just a yay or a nay?
That is not great news at all for Hong Kong, definitely.
In terms of banning plastic packaging?
As in like the current rate of plastic that we have. So it's great that we
Sure.
actual concrete action moving forward,
Yeah, and so actually this is the initial reaction that everyone has is, oh my gosh, ban packaging, that's awesome. I mean, ban plastic packaging, that's great. And I think it is amazing that the government is starting to take action, as you said, and move into the direction of regulation. However, what is really interesting that I've learned from my research is that in Hong Kong, the issue of dealing with waste is a really complex space. And so if you think about how this ban might actually affect food and beverage operators, you one day come up to your, street side dumpling vendor and you say, okay, you can't use your plastic container. What are they going to use instead? Well, the market A is not kind of ready with all of those alternatives in place in terms of having it be price competitive for a lot of the small businesses. And secondly, our waste systems are not really ready to handle these alternative types of packaging materials. So actually, when we say we're going to ban plastic containers, it's great, but we also have to think about the other side of what are we going to do afterwards. And so what the research has shown is actually that options such as compostable packaging or paper-based packaging are not necessarily as viable as one may think, because we actually don't have a composting facility in Hong Kong that can deal with this type of waste. And actually, if you put it in a landfill as you would in Hong Kong, it decomposes and actually emits a lot of greenhouse gases as it sits there. So, when you start to dig into the gory details and think about what happens after the packaging is is discarded, there's a lot of really complex issues that arise. And so it actually works out better in today's conditions to just clean and recycle the single-use plastic box compared to, tossing your plastic-lined bio-based packaging that can actually be properly disposed of here. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Quite interesting. Yeah, that's a different insight that we previously thought.
And it's very counterintuitive because no one wants to keep using plastic. But if actually the systems are in place to properly recycle it in Hong Kong, which it is, that's actually a better option at the moment, if we're still thinking about single-use packaging. And of course, the overlying message should be move away from single use in general. So bring your own container when you can, or try and support, maybe the government can have subsidy systems, schemes in place to support, loaned reusable cups from coffee shops and salad shops and whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
generally moving away from single use is the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's take a look at the audience questions. Actually, just responding to your answer just now,
Mm-hmm.
would heavy investment in recycling and composting centers from non-governmental bodies, would it be possible to counter the waste pollution rather than relying on government?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we considered extensively in our research, because essentially what we did was to look at all of the 4 solution archetypes that one has as a consumer to pursue in Hong Kong. If you are, having your takeaway falafel wrap or whatever it is, one would be, if you get it in your plastic container, to give it a proper clean and then recycle it at one of the community recycling centers. 2 would be to bring your own container there and say, hey, can I use my own box? Hopefully they say yes. C would be to use these compostable packaging alternatives, in which case you'd have to make sure that you, for some reason, might have a composting machine in your backyard, which is not usual for most people, most of the 7.5 million people in Hong Kong. But otherwise, be aware that you can't really dispose of this in the circular economy fashion. And then the 4th solution would be, as I said, these loaned container reusable systems, which are very nascent in Hong Kong and also in the rest of the world. So that's just kind of an overview of the 4 options you have here in Hong Kong. And so when we think about the effort required to switch to these solutions or implement these solutions on different stakeholders, and the cost incurred to different parts of the system, investment in facilities that can handle this from a waste perspective is very important. But at the same time, what is the limiting factor for Hong Kong is not just for example, for instituting a composting facility. It is not just, having that facility there, but also the collection aspect. Now we have to, create a whole nother network that people also may not trust. And, Hong Kong is a very hot and humid place. And so when we think about disposing of food waste and organic waste on the streets, it all becomes very complicated. So there's a lot of logistics involved. And I would say that investment, yes, is definitely needed in this infrastructure, but equally, if not more important, is the education to customers, to consumers, to F&B operators, and otherwise on actually the myths and realities of our waste system in Hong Kong and the different packaging options we have here. So yeah, actually that report is going to be published sometime this year, so you can definitely look forward to that.
Wow, but definitely a long way to go for Hong Kong anyways, in terms of the recycling infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's headed in the right direction, though. And actually, there is a public consultation open right now for that regulation, for the ban on the plastic tableware. And so there's like a form you can fill out if you type in, RDPT, I think it's Regulation on Disposable Plastic Tableware. There's kind of a form where, members of the public can submit their opinion and say, yes, I love that you're moving towards the direction of regulation, but I'm concerned about the packaging options available or an alternatives, like maybe you want to offer some more viable solutions before jumping into a ban, which is actually a very harsh tool from a policy perspective.
Sure.
So kind of went off the rails there
with
that answer. Yeah.
We have another question about climate science and what's the current kind of public attitude towards it? Do you feel that most people trust it at the moment, or kind of any difference between now and 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that might be a better question for you because you're kind of on the front lines with this environmental news platform. But I would say, especially from being in Hong Kong, which is traditionally a very known as a finance hub, what you can see is that a lot of financial institutions are starting to get on board with ESG themed investing. And by ESG, it stands for environmental, social, and governance themes. And so thinking about investing in companies that have, a sense of environmental responsibility towards their operations and in terms of the social side, making sure that they're, being responsible in terms of the impacts they have on society, and from a governance perspective, ensuring that there is equity and diversity within their operations and in their boards, et cetera. And so, whereas, I might not be the best expert to talk about this. Maybe that's your next person to come on and talk about ESG. But I think a lot of companies are really starting to realize that their investors and just greater society actually really cares about environmental issues now. And it's no longer just something to check off for compliance sake. And so what we see is what I've seen just from my almost a year as a data scientist here is that a lot of traditional financial institutions are coming to me to say, hey, do you know any tools on how I can quantify the impacts of my portfolio on the climate? Or, hey, can you tell me what this IPCC report is about? Or how do we use science to, there's a lot of really great questions that are starting to be asked by institutions that I think traditionally we're seen as monoliths who could not be moved in terms of their perspective here. So I think just from that observation on the ground here, I think things are moving in a promising direction. I'm not sure whether the speed or the rate of acceleration will be enough to mitigate our actions in the next 10, 20 years, which is kind of our crucial timeline, but it certainly has changed a lot in the last couple of years.
Sure. Someone asked, kind of linking back to the IPCC report. I'm sure you didn't go through all 1,000 pages of it, but have you noticed that the pandemic has been kind of negatively affecting the statistics, or maybe kind of the changes in the future the next edition of it anyways?
Yeah, I think I would have to go back to read in further depth about the impact that the pandemic has had on these projections, but I would assume that these two concepts of one of the pandemic, which has taken place over the last year, and then the issue of global climate change, which has taken place on the scale of decades, that they're two very different things, kind of like weather and climate. And it's not to say that they're not interacting and that the effects of climate change haven't been, playing off in terms of worsening the risks of things like zoonotic disease transmission. But I think that in terms of they're kind of working on two different levels. And so I think that the IPCC report is completely valid in spite of the pandemic and what it's been, what it means for our world. If anything, I think more people have been have kind of woken up to the fact that there is a lot of really interesting and scary things happening that are tied to both the pandemic and climate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that actually ties in perfectly to a question that we actually been asking to most of our guests at these talks, sure. Which is, do you think that the COVID is actually going to be a great reset for the people to think of in terms of their attitudes, how they treat the environment? Because some people have believed that, it's completely going to be opposite. It's not going to help at all. But I'd be curious to hear about your opinion on this.
Yeah, I think that is a really good question to end on, because especially someone who's been involved in this research for the last few years, it's difficult to strike a balance between, finding amazing things through your research and having big findings, but then also at the same time realizing that the implications of those findings are actually quite dire for the world. And similarly, I think anyone involved in terms of environmental activism or who's attuned to climate issues will struggle to balance a huge sense of doom with trying to stay optimistic and motivated. Mm-hmm. And I think the the pandemic is also similar, right? Because, and I try to stay on the more optimistic side, because what it's shown, I think above all, is that humans are extremely adaptable in the face of adversity. And it's not easy, but it's this last year has shown that we are capable of completely changing our habits almost at the drop of a hat. And it's also shown what it will take and how much more it will take to reduce our carbon footprint and really drop down the emissions that have been accelerating global warming. Mm-hmm. And so I think I'd like to stay more on the optimistic side. I think this is kind of a case in point to say, hey, we kind of are capable of changing. And this, as you said, is a great reset, and it's a time to reevaluate. And it's also, we're at a very critical junction at which, if we don't take, significant measures to reduce our emissions in the next 10 years, we can kind of forget about having this debate over, whether we should have kids or not, or whatever it is, because it's kind of going to be too late by then. And so I guess I do want to wrap this up on a more positive note, because there are a lot of things that seem out of our control, especially talking about the pandemic as well. But there are a lot of things that we can do right now individually to work towards reducing emissions. And one of the things that the pandemic has actually really helped kickstart is flying less. And actually, I referenced a scientific paper that analyzed the impacts of individual behavioral changes in terms of alleviating your impact on the environment and what you can do as an individual. And so the top 3 behavioral changes are actually 1, flying less, 2, driving less, and 3, eating a plant-based diet. And so for most people in Hong Kong, nobody is flying anywhere. A lot of us also aren't driving anywhere, so we're already, off to a great start here. And 3, moving towards a plant-based diet, I think, is something that has become increasingly trendy in the Hong Kong food scene. So these are all great things, and I think it's also important to keep in mind that while urgent action is needed, we can just be patient with yourself on a day-to-day basis, and keep in mind that changes are made in small steps. And, it's a give and take. Sometimes you do want to drive somewhere, and other times you really realize you can do without. And so I think we can also make impacts by being kind of kind to ourselves, and also encouraging others around us rather than kind of villainizing those who eat meat or whatever it is. Just kind of encouraging people to take small steps rather than it being like a all or nothing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, small steps are very important just to make small changes. I think it doesn't have to be big for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. I think just, just the act of having it on your mind will start to key in these behavioral changes, just like starting to bring your own container around at lunchtime. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we're happy to end this conversation here. Is there any way we can get useful updates from your side, especially when you're working on your 2 initiatives with plastic packaging and oceans in Asia?
Yeah, so this is definitely where I feel like I should have a Twitter or an Instagram or something to advertise, but I don't. But you can definitely keep up to date with me. I think on LinkedIn, I will try at least be present there. Or keep in touch with the ADM Capital Foundation's work. We also will be at the Rethink conference in October, which is a large Hong Kong-wide sustainability conference. And if you have any specific questions or want to pick my brain more about anything I was talking about today, feel free to reach out, I guess, on LinkedIn, and I will try my best to go from there.
Great. Is there any other platform also just for general climate science and data science that people can have a look out and check out with?
I guess this is where I say earth.org. No, I promise this was not scripted. But I think actually one really great climate scientist that I really love, who is very good at conveying complex ideas in a much better way than I have been able to in this past hour is a professor called Kimberly Nicholson. She's a professor based in Sweden. So I think if you search Kimberly Nicholson on Twitter or I guess Google, you'll be able to find a lot of her material. And she has some really great podcasts and articles and thought-provoking tweets that can help you stay in the loop.
Fantastic. Well, that's been really great speaking to you. With that, we probably want to bring an end to an evening. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined us, and a really big special thank you to Ashley for being our guest tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure having her share on her insight on the science of climate change. And of course, please follow Earth.org for any latest updates about the environment and about climate solutions around the world. Thank you, everyone, and please stay safe.
All right. Thank you so much.